There is a hill in southeastern Turkey that most people have never heard of, and yet it may be the most important place on the surface of this earth. It sits quietly in the Gurmush mountain range, not far from the Syrian border, about 12 kilometers northeast of a modest city called Şanlıurfa. From a distance, it looks like nothing in particular, just a low, rounded mound rising above the dry plateau, its surface rough with limestone rubble and sparse wind-bent grass. Shepherds have grazed their flocks across its slopes for generations. The locals always knew the hill had something unusual about it. They called it Göbekli Tepe. In Turkish, that means Potbelly Hill, a name as plain and gentle as the landscape itself. And yet, buried beneath that unassuming surface, sealed away under thousands of years of accumulated soil and deliberate fill, are the ruins of something so ancient, so carefully constructed, so philosophically challenging to everything we thought we understood about early human civilization, that archaeologists who study it still find themselves reaching for new language to describe what it means. Not because the words don't exist, but because the implications are so large and so quiet that they tend to settle over you slowly, the way evening light settles over stone. You don't see them all at once. You feel them accumulate.
Göbekli Tepe is, as best as archaeologists can currently determine, the oldest known monumental structure ever built by human hands. Its earliest layers date back to approximately 9,600 BCE. Some estimates push that to 10,000 BCE, or even slightly beyond. That makes it somewhere between 11,000 and 12,000 years old. Let that settle for a moment. 12,000 years. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built around 2560 BCE. Stonehenge was constructed in stages beginning around 3000 BCE. Göbekli Tepe predates both of those by so much time that if you placed Stonehenge at the center of a timeline stretching from today back to Göbekli Tepe, Stonehenge would be closer to the present than to the ancient stones of that Turkish hill, by thousands of years. And here is the thing that makes it stranger still. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not farmers. They had no permanent villages, no domesticated animals, no written language, no metal tools. They were hunter-gatherers, mobile, semi-nomadic people who followed herds and gathered wild grains across a landscape that, back then, was considerably greener and more abundant than the dry scrubland it has since become. These were people we might have once imagined as living on the very edge of survival, barely organized enough to plan a tomorrow, let alone a monument meant to endure for eternity. And yet here stands the evidence, patient and enormous, cut from local limestone, arranged with intention and apparent mathematical care, decorated with some of the most vivid and mysterious animal carvings in all of human prehistory. Here stand the pillars, silent, towering, waiting.
Tonight we are going to spend time with those pillars. We are going to walk through what archaeologists have uncovered and gently consider what it might mean. We are going to meet the people who built this place as best we can across the vast silence of 12 millennia. We are going to try to understand what they might have believed, what they might have felt, what drew them back to this particular hill again and again for thousands of years. And we are going to sit
with the questions that remain unanswered, because at Göbekli Tepe, the unanswered questions are part of the beauty. So settle in, let the lights be low, let whatever tension the day left in your shoulders begin very slowly to release. We are going somewhere old tonight, somewhere quiet, somewhere that existed long before anyone was keeping records, long before anyone had a word for history. We are going to a hill that shouldn't exist, built by people who weren't supposed to be capable of building it, for reasons we still don't entirely understand. And somehow, against all logic and against all expectation, it has waited for us.
To truly understand Göbekli Tepe, we have to first try to understand the world in which it was built. Not the world as it looks today, with its cities and roads and satellites and layered centuries of accumulated human achievement, but the world as it looked in the deep Neolithic, somewhere around 9,500 to 10,000 BCE. A world so different from ours that it requires a kind of quiet, imaginative effort to enter it. Not impossible, but deliberate. You have to slow your assumptions down and let the older picture form. The period in question is called the pre-pottery Neolithic, specifically the pre-pottery Neolithic A, or PPNA, which archaeologists use to describe a phase of human life that existed before the widespread adoption of farming, before the regular firing and use of ceramic pottery, and before the establishment of the kinds of permanent, dense settlements we typically associate with the word civilization. This was a transitional era, a hinge point in human experience, the last long breath before the world changed fundamentally and irrevocably. The people who lived in this period in what is now southeastern Turkey and the surrounding region of Upper Mesopotamia were, by our best reconstruction, organized into relatively small, mobile social groups. They did not plant fields in the way we understand farming. They did not stay in one place year-round and wait for crops they had sown to rise from the earth. Instead, they moved through a landscape that was, in this era, extraordinarily generous. The climate around 9,500 BCE was warmer and wetter than it would later become. The Jermosh Mountains and the surrounding plateau received more rainfall. Grasslands spread across the hills. Wild rivers were fuller. And through this greener world moved vast herds of animals that the people of this era knew intimately. Aurochs roamed the plains. These were the wild ancestors of domestic cattle, enormous and powerful, standing nearly 2 meters at the shoulder, with sweeping horns that could span more than 3 meters from tip to tip. They were not tame, they were not managed, they were hunted, with considerable courage and coordinated effort. Alongside them lived wild gazelles in their thousands, streaming across the open ground in long, glittering herds that must have been among the most spectacular sights on Earth. There were wild boar moving through the forest edges, deer in the woodlands, onagers, which are wild asses drinking at the rivers, wolves, lions, and leopards threading through the shadows at the margins of human camps. Above all of this, the sky was busy with birds. Vultures circled on the thermals, enormous and unhurried. Cranes migrated through in their thousands, filling the air with their hollow, ancient calls. Wild ducks and geese gathered on the seasonal lakes. The sky was, in ways that are hard to imagine now, a living presence, a moving ceiling of meaning and information. The plant world was similarly abundant. Wild emmer wheat and wild einkorn wheat grew in dense natural stands across the hillsides of this region. People harvested them with flint-tipped sickles, grinding the grain between stones. Wild lentils and pistachios grew nearby, almond trees, fig trees. The land provided if you knew how to read it, and these people knew how to read it with extraordinary precision. They had been doing so for tens of thousands of years. They made their tools from flint, knapped with skill and a kind of unhurried mastery that produced blades of real elegance, sharp enough to cut hide and bone and wood. They made ornaments from shell and stone. They almost certainly wore clothing made from animal skins, and evidence from Göbekli Tepe itself suggests some of them may have worn fox pelts as part of ceremonial or ritual dress. They had language, almost certainly sophisticated language, capable of expressing not just practical information about food and danger, but stories, cosmologies, explanations, fears, hopes.
What they did not have, as far as we know, was a fixed address. Their settlements, such as they were temporary, seasonal camps, gathering places, points along routes they followed according to the rhythms of animal migration and plant availability. They were not wandering aimlessly. Their movements were organized and purposeful, shaped by deep knowledge of a landscape they had inhabited for countless generations. But they were, at least in the conventional understanding of the term, homeless in the permanent sense. This is what makes Göbekli Tepe so profoundly strange, because to build what they built at Göbekli Tepe, these people could not have simply passed through. They had to stay. They had to organize. They had to feed a large workforce over a sustained period of time. They had to quarry stone, transport it, carve it, raise it, and then do it all again and again for what appear to be centuries. The physical evidence of that effort sits in the ground of that Turkish hill right now, patient and enormous, waiting for us to fully grasp what it means.
We will come to that in due time, but for now, hold this image in your mind. Hold the picture of a world that was older and greener, where people moved through an unenclosed landscape under enormous skies, where the animals on the hills were wild and the grains on the slopes were uncultivated, and the stars were so clear on a cloudless night that the whole dome of the heavens felt close enough to touch. Hold that world, and then ask yourself what kind of thought, what kind of feeling, what kind of shared belief could bring those people together to haul stones and carve symbols into the limestone of a particular hill and raise pillars taller than two men standing on each other's shoulders. Whatever the answer is, it speaks to something deep and persistent in human nature, something that does not seem to require writing or agriculture or cities to express itself, something that has always been present in us, reaching upward. Section 3. A Forgotten Discovery. The Story of Klaus Schmidt. The story of how Göbekli Tepe was found, ignored, and then found again is itself a kind of parable about the way we sometimes walk right past the most extraordinary things in the world, too certain of what we know to see what we don't.
The first time modern eyes paused over the hill was 1963. A joint survey team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University was conducting a broad archaeological survey of the region, cataloguing sites of potential interest across this part of southeastern Anatolia. One of the surveyors noted the mound. They saw limestone slabs scattered across the surface of the hill, protruding from the earth at odd angles. Someone recorded the observation. Someone noted that it might be worth a closer look. And then, with quiet efficiency, the survey moved on to the next site and the next. The assumption, reasonable enough at the time, was that the limestone fragments were probably the remains of a Byzantine-era cemetery, or perhaps a minor Islamic burial ground, something modest, something medieval, something, in the grand scheme of archaeological ambition, not especially urgent. And so the mound sat. Decades passed. The shepherds continued to graze their flocks across it. The wind continued to blow dust across the exposed limestone, and 11,000 years of carefully built stone circles continued to sleep beneath the surface, undisturbed. Then, in October of 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt made a decision that would change his life, and, in a more modest but real way, the story of human civilization.
Schmidt was working in the region at the time, familiar with other Neolithic sites in Turkey, specifically a site called Nevali Çuori, which had recently been excavated and which had yielded some remarkable early Neolithic finds. He had read the old survey report. He was curious. He took a detour to look at the hill. And within moments of arriving, before he had even begun to dig, he understood that what lay beneath the surface of Göbekli Tepe was not a cemetery from the Christian or Islamic eras. It was something much, much older. The flint tools scattered across the surface were of a type he recognized immediately as belonging to the pre-pottery Neolithic. The shape of the mound, the way the limestone fragments were distributed, the sheer density of worked stone visible in the existing erosion cuts, all of it spoke a language that Schmidt could read. He later described the moment with characteristic understatement. He looked at the site and realized he had found something that would keep him busy for the rest of his life. He was right. He dedicated the next 20 years to Gobekli Tepe. He returned in 1995 and began formal excavations in collaboration with the German Archaeological Institute and the Schindler-Oever Museum. What emerged from the earth over those early seasons of digging exceeded every expectation. Circular enclosures of massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged with geometric precision, animal carvings of extraordinary detail and apparent symbolic complexity, evidence of repeated construction over millennia, with older enclosures deliberately filled in and new ones built on top. The site just kept opening up, deeper and stranger and more magnificent than anyone had imagined. Schmidt was a careful, patient man by temperament, well suited to the slow, methodical nature of serious archaeology. He resisted sensationalism. He pushed back against fringe theories that wanted to associate Göbekli Tepe with Atlantis or alien construction or lost super-civilizations. The evidence, he insisted, was remarkable enough on its own. Hunter-gatherers built this, real human beings working with stone tools and collective organization built this. That fact, he argued, was more astonishing and more meaningful than any supernatural explanation could ever be, because it said something true about the depth and range of human capacity in ways that fantasy could not. He gave interviews, he wrote papers, he brought colleagues from around the world to walk through the enclosures and look at the pillars. He became, over those years, one of those rare archaeologists who genuinely captures the public imagination, not through drama or controversy, but through the quiet conviction of someone who has looked at something wonderful and simply wants to share what he sees. And then, in July of 2014, Klaus Schmidt died suddenly of a heart attack while on vacation. He was 60 years old. He had not finished. There was so much more to excavate, so much more to understand. His colleagues mourned him not only as a scholar, but as the person most responsible for the site's identity in the world, the person who had recognized it, championed it, and given it decades of devoted attention.
Today,
Excavations at Göbekli Tepe continue under the direction of Lee Clare, also of the German Archaeological Institute, working in close partnership with Turkish authorities and the Şanlıurfa Museum. The site was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in July of 2018, described in the nomination documents as one of the first manifestations of human-made monumental architecture. Work continues every season, and with every season the site gives up a little more of what it has been holding. But the majority of it, and this is something worth keeping in your mind as we go forward, is still in the ground. Less than 5% of the known site has been excavated. The story of Göbekli Tepe is, in the most literal possible sense, still being written. What we know is extraordinary. What we don't know yet may be more extraordinary still. Section 4. The Architecture of Wonder. Enclosures and Layout. Let us walk through the site itself now, slowly, the way you would if you were actually there. Imagine the dust is fine and pale beneath your feet. The air has that dry, mineral quality of high limestone country in summer. The sky is enormous and a very deep blue. And ahead of you, partially exposed from the hillside, are the walls of the enclosures, their stones warm with accumulated heat. Göbekli Tepe, as it has been excavated, consists of a series of circular and oval structures built into and out of the bedrock of the hill. These structures are called enclosures, and they are typically labeled with letters. The four most thoroughly excavated are enclosures A, B, C, and D, though additional enclosures have been identified both through excavation and through non-invasive geophysical surveys. In total, as of the most recent surveys, archaeologists believe there may be as many as 20 or more distinct enclosures spread across the mound. Only a handful have been opened. Each enclosure follows a broadly similar pattern, though each is also distinct in its details and character. The basic form is a roughly circular or oval interior space, ranging in diameter from about 10 to 20 meters, enclosed by a low dry stone wall set with a series of T-shaped limestone pillars at regular intervals. At the center of each enclosure stand two taller pillars, set opposite each other, both oriented in a consistent direction that appears to have been deliberately chosen. Smaller pillars ring the interior, set into the wall or standing freely, facing inward toward those central two. The effect, if you were to stand in the middle of one of these enclosures, would be something like standing in a gathering of enormous stone figures, because that is, as we will come to understand, effectively what they are. Not columns, not structural supports in any conventional sense, figures, presences, something between architecture and sculpture, and perhaps something else entirely, something for which we do not have a precise modern word. The floors of the enclosures are generally made of beaten limestone, smoothed and finished. Some have benches carved from the rock around the interior perimeter. These benches suggest seating, which in turn suggests gathering, which in turn suggests that whatever happened in these spaces was something communal and organized. People sat in them. People came to be inside them. Enclosure D is the largest and most celebrated, and it is where the most famous carved pillar, Pillar 43, stands. The two central pillars of Enclosure D are among the tallest on the site, each standing roughly 5.5 meters high and weighing in the region of 10 to 15 tons. They are set into carved stone sockets in the floor, which means they are not simply resting there by gravity alone, but were deliberately anchored. Between them and the ring of smaller pillars, the enclosure has a diameter of roughly 20 meters, making it a significant interior space, capable of holding a substantial number of people. Enclosure C is notable for its slightly different character, with some of the animal carvings suggesting a different set of symbolic priorities than Enclosure D. Enclosures A and B are somewhat smaller and have been interpreted by some researchers as belonging to a slightly later phase, though the chronology of the site's construction is complex and still under active study.
What the geophysical surveys have revealed about the unexcavated portions of the mound is remarkable. Ground-penetrating radar and cesium magnetometry have mapped the outlines of additional enclosures buried beneath the surface, arranged across the mound in what appears to be a planned spatial distribution. They are not scattered randomly. They have been placed. Their relationship to each other seems intentional, the way buildings in a city are intentional, or the way rooms in a temple complex are intentional. None of these unexcavated enclosures have given up their pillars yet. None of their carvings have been seen by modern eyes. Whatever symbols they contain, whatever animals cover their stones, whatever arrangements of form and meaning their builders expressed in carved limestone, all of it remains sealed in the earth, for now, waiting. What is perhaps most striking about the architecture of Göbekli Tepe, once you sit with it long enough, is not the impressiveness of the individual pillars, though they are impressive. It is the evidence of continuous long-term engagement with this place. The site was not built all at once. It was built over many generations, possibly many centuries, with older enclosures being deliberately backfilled and new ones raised in their place or alongside them. This was not a single burst of communal ambition. This was an ongoing, sustained relationship between a community and a particular piece of landscape. This hill mattered to these people across a span of time so long that it likely exceeded anyone's living memory. The builders of the later enclosures may have had no direct connection to the builders of the earliest ones, except through whatever traditions, stories, and beliefs were passed from one generation to the next. Whatever those traditions said about this hill, they said it compellingly enough to keep people coming back and building for thousands of years. Section 5. The Pillars. Silent giants in stone. If the enclosures are the rooms, the pillars are the presences that fill them, and they demand a kind of attention that is hard to describe. Not because they are immediately beautiful in the way that a painting or a Greek statue might be beautiful, but because they have a quality of weight and intention that settles over you slowly, the way significance often does. They have been standing here for 12,000 years, and they know it. Let us begin with the physical reality of them. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are carved from local limestone, quarried from the bedrock of the hill itself or from nearby outcrops. Limestone, for those unfamiliar, is a sedimentary rock that forms from the compressed remains of ancient marine organisms, and it has the useful quality of being relatively soft when freshly quarried, hardening on exposure to air over time. This means it can be worked with flint tools, which is exactly what the builders of Göbekli Tepe used. There was no metal at this site, no bronze, no copper, certainly no iron. Every cut in every pillar was made by human hands holding tools of knapped stone. The T shape of the pillars is one of the most immediately distinctive things about them. When you see them for the first time, even in a photograph, the form is unlike anything else in prehistoric architecture. The shaft of the pillar is tall and relatively narrow, rectangular in cross-section. At the top, a wide, flat cap extends to either side,
creating the horizontal bar of the T. The proportions vary from pillar to pillar, but the form is consistent across the site, and consistent also, it should be noted, with similar pillars found at other Neolithic sites in the region, suggesting a shared architectural tradition across a considerable geographic area. Below the carved arms, on the front face of many pillars, there is a carved belt, a wide band running around the midsection of the figure, sometimes with a circular buckle or clasp at the center front. The consistency of this belt across multiple pillars and multiple enclosures suggests it carries a specific meaning, perhaps indicating ritual status or a particular role within the cosmological framework the site embodies. Below the belt, on some pillars, there is what appears to be a loincloth or hanging garment, and on at least one pillar, identified as Pillar 31, what hangs from the belt is not a generic loincloth, but what appears to be a fox pelt, the tail and body of a fox, depicted in enough anatomical detail to be clearly identifiable. This detail is intriguing for reasons we will come to shortly when we talk about the fox's symbolic role across the site as a whole. But in the context of the pillar as a human figure, it suggests that whoever or whatever these stone beings represent, they were depicted as dressed, as adorned, as having an identity that could be expressed through what they wore. The faces of the pillars are blank. The flat top of the T, the head of the figure, has no features carved into it, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. This blankness is deliberate. It is not a failure of skill. The people who carved detailed foxes and complex snake arrangements into the sides of these pillars were capable of carving a face. They chose not to. The facelessness of the figures is itself a statement, though exactly what it says is something we are left to consider without the benefit of a key. Some researchers interpret the faceless T-pillars as representations of deities, gods of a kind, nameless and ancient, and without the specific human features that would make them too particular, too limited. Others interpret them as ancestor figures, the spirits or commemorative images of important individuals, leaders or shamans or ritual specialists who died and were transformed into permanent stone presences for the community. Still others suggest they represent some kind of mythological being that exists between human and divine, a class of entity for which we have no good contemporary parallel. What all of these interpretations share is the recognition that these are not decorative objects, they are not furniture, they are not structural necessities, they are intended beings, placed with intention, oriented with intention, decorated with intention. They are meant to be present in a way that matters. Whatever was happening in these enclosures, it was happening in the company of these figures, and whatever meaning the enclosures held, a significant portion of that meaning resided in the stone bodies of the pillars themselves. Over 200 such pillars have now been identified at Göbekli Tepe through excavation and survey. Only a fraction of them have been fully examined. The rest wait in the dark earth of the mound, arms at their sides, belts around their waists, faces empty and patient, as they have waited for 12,000 years. Section 6. The Animal Carvings, a Symbolic World in Stone. If the T-pillars are the presences, the animal carvings are the language. And it is a language that we can partially read, in the sense that we can identify the species depicted and note their frequency and arrangement, but whose grammar and meaning remain at their deeper levels stubbornly opaque. This is part of what makes Göbekli Tepe so persistently fascinating. It speaks to you. You can see that it is saying something, something organized and intentional and layered, but the full meaning remains just out of reach. Let us begin with what is most common. The single most frequently depicted animal across the pillars at Göbekli Tepe is the snake. Snakes appear on pillars in nearly every enclosure, sometimes singly, sinuous and clear, their bodies rendered in confident carved lines, sometimes in groups of 3 or 4, arranged in parallel, and sometimes in what can only be described as swarms, groups of 12 or more snakes moving together across the surface of a pillar in the same direction, like a river of scales. The snake clearly occupied a position of central symbolic importance for the people who built this place. It appears too often and in too many configurations to be merely decorative. Across many world mythologies, ancient and persistent, the snake carries associations with transformation, with the boundary between life and death, with the underworld and with regeneration. These associations appear in ancient Mesopotamian mythology, in Egyptian religion, in Greek tradition, in the stories of cultures spread across vast geographical and temporal distances. Whether the snake at Göbekli Tepe carries similar meanings, we cannot say with certainty, but the intensity of its presence here suggests that whatever it meant, it was fundamental.
After snakes, the fox appears with striking regularity. Foxes are carved onto central pillars, onto the perimeter pillars, and they appear at the portal entrance to enclosure B, flanking a bull's head, a placement of obvious deliberate significance. The fox in this region today is a swift, cunning, adaptable predator, a creature of the edges and the dusk, comfortable in the borderlands between wild and settled space. Some researchers have noted intriguing possible connections between the fox symbolism at Göbekli Tepe and certain astronomical interpretations of the site, in which the fox is linked to a specific constellation region of the sky. This is speculative, but not unreasonable, and we will touch on astronomical theories in more detail in our discussion of Pillar 43. Wild boar appear on multiple pillars, their tusked, bristled profiles carved with evident familiarity. These animals would have been hunted by the builders of Göbekli Tepe, encountered regularly in the wooded hillside margins of the landscape, and they carry a quality of dangerous energy, of obstinate power, that the carvings seem to honor rather than merely record. There is something almost reverential in the way the animals are depicted here, not as trophies, not as prey, but as entities with their own weight and meaning. Vultures occupy a particularly prominent place in the symbolic world of Gobekli Tepe. The vulture is a bird associated in virtually every culture that has encountered it with death and transformation. It is the cleaner of the world, the creature that transforms the dead into something that feeds the living. In the Neolithic Near East, vultures were also associated with a particular funerary practice called excarnation, in which the bodies of the dead were exposed to birds, allowing the flesh to be removed before the bones were collected and processed. There is evidence that this practice was observed in the region around the time of Göbekli Tepe's construction, and the prominence of vultures in the site's iconography may well reflect that funerary cosmology directly. Cranes appear on several pillars in elegant, almost delicate carvings, their long necks and legs rendered with a grace that contrasts pleasingly with the power and mass of the stones themselves. Cranes migrate through this region in their thousands, a seasonal pulse of movement and sound that would have been one of the great spectacles of the ancient world in this landscape.
Their appearance in the carvings may reflect calendrical awareness, a marking of the passage of seasons and irregular rhythms of the natural world. Scorpions appear on Pillar 43 and elsewhere, their curved tails and articulated bodies carved with accurate detail. Scorpions are dangerous, nocturnal, creatures of the desert margins and the rocky ground. In later Mesopotamian astronomical tradition, the scorpion is associated with a specific constellation. Whether that association has roots here, at this 12,000-year-old site, in the same broad cultural region, is one of the many tantalizing open questions that Göbekli Tepe leaves trailing behind it.
Aurochs, lions, gazelles, ducks, ibis, and a number of animals that are harder to identify with certainty also appear across the pillars. The total diversity of species depicted is remarkable, suggesting that the builders of this site had an extraordinarily detailed and intimate relationship with the wildlife of their world, the kind of relationship that comes from thousands of years of careful, attentive coexistence. And then there are the abstract symbols, the H-shaped figures, carved on pillars and stones across the site, whose meaning is entirely opaque to us. Circular symbols, hand-shaped markings, geometric patterns that may represent something cosmological, or may represent something entirely practical, or may represent something for which we simply have no frame of reference. These symbols have been compared to markings found at other Neolithic sites in the region, suggesting that they belong to a shared symbolic vocabulary that was in use across a wide area during this period. But the dictionary of that vocabulary has not been found. We see the words, we do not have the definitions. What we can say, looking at the full range of animal carvings and abstract markings across Göbekli Tepe, is that this was not naive or accidental decoration. This was a coherent symbolic program, executed with skill and apparent intention across a site that was continuously developed over centuries. The animals were chosen deliberately. Their placement on specific pillars was deliberate. Their combinations were deliberate. This was a community with a sophisticated symbolic and cosmological life, expressing it in the most permanent and visible medium available to them. Section 7. Pillar 43. The most famous stone in prehistory.
Of all the pillars at Göbekli Tepe, and there are many that deserve close attention, one stands apart from all the others in terms of the density and apparent complexity of what has been carved into its surface. It is Pillar 43, located in Enclosure D, and it has been called, without much exaggeration, the most important and fascinating carved stone in all of human prehistory. Pillar 43 is not the tallest pillar on the site. It belongs to the ring of perimeter pillars in Enclosure D, and so it is somewhat smaller in scale than those massive central stones. But what it carries on its surface is unlike anything else yet found at the site. The most prominent image on the upper face of Pillar 43 is a large vulture. It is depicted with wings spread wide, seemingly in flight, or perhaps standing with wings extended in display. The vulture is large, central, and unmistakably dominant in the composition. It faces to one side. Below it is a circle, a sphere, which the vulture appears to be either holding up or watching over. The precise meaning of this circle is debated. Some researchers interpret it as the sun. Some interpret it as the head of a decapitated figure. Some see it as a symbolic vessel or container. Whatever it represents, its pairing with the vulture at the center of this composition seems deliberate and significant.
Below the vulture figure, on the same pillar,
is one of the most genuinely strange images at the entire site: a headless human figure. The body is rendered in outline, arms at the sides, legs visible, clearly human in form. But where the head should be, there is nothing. The body ends at the neck. This is not damage or erosion. It is a deliberate artistic choice. A headless person depicted in stone on a 12,000-year-old pillar, standing beneath a vulture with a sphere. The image is striking enough to have occupied the attention of many researchers for years. The headless figure may relate to the practice of excarnation already mentioned in connection with vultures. In a world where the dead were left for birds, the vulture and the headless body would form a natural symbolic pairing, one that speaks to beliefs about the soul's journey after death, about what happens to the self when the body is dissolved by time and nature. It may represent a mythological scene, a moment from a story that was told around fires and passed from generation to generation. It may represent something else entirely. To the right of the vulture on Pillar 43, there is a scorpion. Below that, on the lower surface of the pillar, there are additional images, including what appears to be a bag or bucket-shaped symbol that recurs at various points across the site, in a form that has puzzled researchers considerably. These bag-shaped symbols appear not only at Göbekli Tepe, but at other early Neolithic sites in the region, and in later Mesopotamian art, where similar shapes appear in religious and ritual contexts. What they represent in their Neolithic context is unknown. But it is Pillar 43's astronomical interpretation that has generated the most interest outside the specialist literature, and that has brought the pillar to the attention of a much wider audience. In 2017, researchers at the University of Edinburgh published a paper in which they proposed that the imagery on Pillar 43 could be interpreted as a record of a specific astronomical event, specifically a cometary impact or fragmentation event that is hypothesized to have occurred around 10,950 BCE. This event, sometimes referred to as the Younger Dryas impact event, is a highly controversial but actively debated hypothesis in the scientific literature. The idea is that a comet or meteor broke apart in Earth's atmosphere at approximately that date, causing widespread environmental disruption that contributed to the sharp cooling of the Younger Dryas period, a climatic cold snap that lasted roughly 1,000 years. The Edinburgh researchers proposed that the animals on Pillar 43, the vulture, the scorpion, and others, may correspond to specific constellations as they appeared in the sky at the time of this hypothesized impact, essentially encoding a star map of that catastrophic night in stone. The circle held by the vulture in this interpretation represents the sun or possibly a comet. The pillar, they argued, was a memorial, a record in stone of a cosmic disaster that the people of this region had preserved in their collective memory across generations. This question matters because the answer forces you to revise some fundamental assumptions about what hunter-gatherer societies were capable of. And in doing so, it changes not just the story of Göbekli Tepe, but the broader story of human social complexity. Let us begin with the stone itself. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are carved from local limestone. This was a practical choice in one sense. Limestone was available. It occurs naturally in the bedrock of the hill and in the surrounding landscape. You did not need to import it from a great distance. But working it, particularly working it into the specific T shape, the carved arms, the detailed animal reliefs, and then moving it from quarry to enclosure and raising it into a standing position was an enormous undertaking. In the quarry area on the site, archaeologists have found something remarkable, an unfinished pillar. It is still embedded in the bedrock from which it was being cut, the extraction process abandoned at some point in the past, for reasons we don't know. This unfinished pillar is extraordinary evidence of the process because it shows clearly how the builders went about their work. They would identify a suitable section of the limestone bedrock and begin cutting channels around it, using flint tools to groove and peck away at the stone, gradually freeing the block from the surrounding rock. The unfinished pillar at Göbekli Tepe is estimated to be about 7 meters long and would have weighed somewhere in the region of 50 tons. It is the largest pillar known from the site, and it never left the quarry. The actual pillars that were successfully raised in the enclosures are smaller than this, most in the range of 3 to 5.5 meters and weighing somewhere between 10 and 20 tons. But even at those dimensions, the challenge of moving them from quarry to enclosure was substantial. These were Stone Age people with no domesticated animals, no wheeled vehicles, no pulleys or block and tackle systems as far as we know. What they had were ropes, wooden sledges, wooden levers, ramps of compacted earth, and, most importantly, people. Lots of people working together in organized coordination. Experimental archaeologists who try to reconstruct ancient techniques by actually attempting them with period-appropriate tools and methods have determined that moving a pillar of the size found at Göbekli Tepe over rough ground without wheels or animals would require a sustained team effort of somewhere between several dozen to several hundred people, depending on the specific weight of the pillar, the distance to be covered, and the terrain. Even at the more conservative estimates, you are talking about a coordinated effort that requires a social structure capable of organizing, directing, and sustaining large-scale collective labor. This is significant. Hunter-gatherer societies of the Neolithic era were not generally thought to have possessed this kind of organized social complexity. The traditional model of human development assumed that this level of coordination, the kind required to mobilize and direct hundreds of workers toward a single complex goal, only emerged after agriculture had created settled communities with surplus food, established leadership hierarchies, and the administrative capacity to manage large groups of people. Göbekli Tepe suggests that model was wrong, or at least incomplete.
Once the pillars were moved to the enclosure site, they had to be raised. The stone sockets in the floors of the enclosures, into which the bases of the pillars were set, are a critical piece of engineering. By setting the base of the pillar in a carved socket in the bedrock floor, the builders gave the pillar a secure anchor point. It would not walk or tip under its own weight once seated, but getting it into that socket required lifting it from horizontal to vertical, or at least maneuvering it to a steep enough angle to slide into the socket, while maintaining control of several tons of stone. The most likely method, based on what we know of similar construction projects in other prehistoric contexts, involved earthen ramps, wooden levers, and a great deal of very careful, very coordinated effort. After the pillars were raised, they were carved. Whether some of the carving was done in situ on the standing pillar or before the pillar was raised on the horizontal stone is not fully settled. Both approaches have been suggested. Some details, particularly the reliefs on the upper portions and the faces of the pillars, may have been easier to carve before erection. Others may have been added, refined, or deepened after the stone was standing. What is clear is that the carving required sustained, skilled labor with flint tools, probably over extended periods. And then, when an enclosure was complete, another was begun, and then another. This process apparently continued for somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years. Generation after generation of builders,
working in the same place, following the same general architectural principles, but adapting and evolving the specifics of their enclosures over time. What kept them coming back? What sustained this project across so many generations? The answer to that question, or at least the most persuasive answer yet proposed by researchers, is belief. Something happened at this hill that mattered to these people in the deepest possible way. Something religious, something cosmological, something that generated enough shared conviction to motivate the enormous and ongoing investment of labor required to keep building, keep carving, keep raising these enormous stones toward the sky. Whatever was happening at Göbekli Tepe, it was important. It was important enough to make people do things that were, by any practical measure, extraordinarily difficult. And that tells us something about the depth and seriousness of their inner lives that no amount of stone tools or animal bone can communicate as directly. Section 9. Who gathered here? Feasting, ritual, and community. One of the most telling pieces of evidence from Göbekli Tepe is not the stones themselves. It is what was found mixed in with the fill between the stones. Over the course of the excavations, archaeologists have recovered more than 100,000 fragments of animal bone from the site. That is not a small number. It is not the accumulated refuse of a few families living quietly beside a shrine. It is the archaeological signature of feasting on an enormous scale. The bones come from a wide variety of wild animal species. Gazelle bones are particularly abundant, suggesting that large numbers of gazelles were hunted and brought to the site. Aurochs bones are present in significant quantities. Wild boar, red deer, various bird species. The bones show cut marks and signs of butchering, consistent with the preparation and consumption of meat. They show evidence of being cracked open, probably for marrow, the nutritious fatty substance inside bones that provides significant caloric value. And they show signs of having been cooked. This is the archaeological evidence of communal feasting, carried out repeatedly over extended periods at this location. Someone was organizing large communal meals at Gobekli Tepe. Someone was coordinating the hunting and transport of animals to this site in sufficient quantities to feed what must have been a considerable number of people. The logistics of this, in the context of a pre-pottery Neolithic hunter-gatherer world, are significant. Hunting enough wild game to feed hundreds of people, transporting it to a specific location, preparing and distributing it collectively, all of this requires coordination, planning, and some form of social organization capable of directing and sustaining that effort. This feasting is almost certainly connected to the ritual life of the site. In many cultures, past and present, communal eating is one of the primary mechanisms by which social bonds are created and reinforced, by which obligations are established, by which relationships between communities are negotiated, and by which the relationship between humans and the sacred or supernatural world is expressed and maintained. Feasts are not just meals, they are social acts with layers of meaning that extend well beyond the nutritional. At Gobekli Tepe, the feasting evidence suggests that people came to this site in groups, possibly from some distance, and participated together in rituals that included large communal meals. The site may have functioned as a kind of gathering place or pilgrimage center for a number of different regional communities, a neutral ground where people who might otherwise be competitors over hunting territory could come together in a shared ritual context. There is another detail that supports this interpretation. Despite the evidence of extensive activity at the site, and despite the presence of food remains and fire-related materials, the earliest layers of Göbekli Tepe show no clear evidence of permanent residential structures. There are no house foundations from the PPNA period, no storage pits of the kind associated with year-round domestic use, no evidence of the kind of settled domestic life that leaves a characteristic archaeological signature. People were at this site in large numbers, apparently for extended periods, but they do not seem to have lived there permanently, at least not in the earliest phases. This absence of evidence for permanent habitation is consistent with the interpretation of Göbekli Tepe as a gathering place or ceremonial center rather than a village. People came here for specific purposes, ritual purposes connected to the enclosures and the pillars, and whatever cosmological framework those structures embodied. They ate together, they built together, they participated in whatever ceremonies the site was designed to support, and then, presumably, they dispersed back to their various seasonal camps and hunting grounds, carrying with them whatever the visit had given them, whatever shared experience, whatever renewed sense of connection to each other, and to the belief system that the stone figures on the hill represented.
The human remains found at the site add another dimension to this picture. Fragments of human skull have been recovered from Göbekli Tepe, some of them bearing cut marks. This is consistent with practices of skull veneration or ancestor worship that are documented at other Neolithic sites in the region, where specific individuals, possibly important leaders or ritual specialists, were commemorated through the deliberate preservation and curation of their skulls after death. These skulls may have been kept and displayed in ceremonial contexts, used in rituals that reinforced ancestral connections and maintained community identity across generations. If the T-shaped pillars represent ancestors or important spiritual beings, and if skull veneration was practiced at the site, then Göbekli Tepe begins to emerge as a place where the relationship between the living and the dead was actively maintained and negotiated, a place where community identity was rooted not just in present-day social relationships, but in a long chain of connection stretching back to specific recognized ancestors, possibly the very figures represented by the stone pillars. The social implications of all of this are profound. Göbekli Tepe was not built by isolated individuals. It was built by a community or by a network of communities that shared beliefs, shared labor, shared meals, and shared a relationship with this particular place that was deep enough and meaningful enough to sustain the effort of building and rebuilding over many centuries. In a world without agriculture, without writing, without metal, they built something together that has outlasted everything else from their era. That is not an accident. That is the product of a rich and coherent social and spiritual life. Section 10. The greatest riddle. Did religion come before farming? Here, now, is the question that has put Göbekli Tepe at the center of a genuine revolution in how archaeologists and historians understand the development of human civilization. And it is a question that, once raised, has the quality of pulling on a loose thread that turns out to be connected to almost everything. The traditional story of civilization, the one that has been taught in schools and textbooks for most of the past century, goes roughly like this. First, humans discovered agriculture. They began cultivating plants and domesticating animals, which allowed them to produce food more reliably and in greater quantities than hunting and gathering allowed. This agricultural surplus freed some people from the constant labor of food acquisition and allowed for specialization. Craftspeople, administrators, priests. The surplus also allowed populations to grow and communities to become permanent and larger, leading to villages and eventually to towns and cities. With settled communities came hierarchy, governance, and eventually the complex social structures that we associate with civilization. And with all of that, at some later stage, came organized religion, monuments, temples, the whole apparatus of collective spiritual life. First food,
then settlement, then society, then religion. That is the sequence. Göbekli Tepe does not fit that sequence. Göbekli Tepe comes before the domestication of the major crop plants in this region. It comes before permanent settled villages. It comes before pottery. It was built by hunter-gatherers who, by all available evidence, had not yet made the transition to farming. And yet it is a monument of extraordinary complexity and apparent spiritual significance, built with a level of social organization that the traditional model says should not yet have existed.
So either the traditional model is wrong, or something else is going on. And Klaus Schmidt, along with a number of other researchers, proposed something else that is going on. Something that has become one of the most provocative and debated hypotheses in contemporary archaeology. The hypothesis is this: at Gobekli Tepe, religion came first. The need to build and maintain a sacred site generated the need to feed a large workforce. The need to feed a large workforce drove experimentation with cultivating wild plants more intensively than was typical for hunter-gatherer subsistence. And that experimentation over generations led to the domestication of plants. Agriculture did not produce religion. Religion produced agriculture. This is a reversal of the traditional model so complete that it initially met with considerable skepticism. But the evidence supporting it, though not conclusive, is genuinely suggestive. Consider this: the area around Göbekli Tepe, the foothills of the Karachadadar Mountains, just 30 kilometers to the northeast, is precisely where genetic studies of wheat have identified the origin point of domestic einkorn wheat. This is not a coincidence of geography that can be casually dismissed. Einkorn wheat was one of the first domesticated cereal grains in human history, and its wild ancestor grew in abundance in this exact region. The people who gathered at Gobekli Tepe harvested wild wheat from the hillsides around this area. And somewhere in this region, at some point during the period when Gobekli Tepe was in active use, someone began doing something slightly different with those wild wheat stands, something more deliberate, more cultivating, less purely gathering. And that slight shift in behavior, repeated over generations and gradually intensified, became farming. Was it the logistical pressure of feeding large groups of pilgrims and workers at the site that drove that experimentation? Was the gathering at Gobekli Tepe the social context in which the knowledge and practice of early cultivation was developed and shared between communities? We cannot prove this. The evidence is suggestive rather than definitive. But it is remarkable that the site sits almost exactly at the genetic origin point of one of civilization's most transformative crops, and that the period of its active use aligns closely with the period during which that crop was domesticated. More broadly, Gobekli Tepe invites us to consider the possibility that human beings were not rational economic actors who first solved the problem of food production and then, having secured a surplus and some leisure time, decided to build temples. It invites us to consider instead that the impulse toward the sacred, toward collective ritual, toward the making of shared meaning, was not a luxury that came after material security, but a fundamental driver of human behavior that was operative from the very beginning, shaping the material world to serve its needs, including, possibly, reshaping the relationship between human communities and the wild plants of the landscape. What this means for our understanding of ourselves, of what we are and what we have always been, is worth sitting with quietly. Because if it is true, it means that the deepest human impulse, the one that has driven the most extraordinary collective efforts in our history, was not hunger, it was meaning. Section 11. The deliberate burial. Why was it buried alive?
Around 8200 BCE, something changed at Göbekli Tepe. The people who had been building enclosures and maintaining the site for somewhere between 1000 and 1500 years, or perhaps even longer, stopped. They did not simply abandon the place and walk away. They did something far more deliberate and far more strange. They buried it. The backfill that now covers the enclosures and pillars of Göbekli Tepe is not natural accumulation. It is not the slow, unintentional drift of wind-blown dust and organic debris that covers most archaeological sites over time. It is deliberate. The material used to fill the enclosures was brought to the site from elsewhere. Flint chips and other stone tool debris that does not originate at Göbekli Tepe itself, mixed with animal bones, the accumulated refuse of what appears to have been a final, sustained period of activity. Someone packed this material carefully into the enclosures, filling them from the floor up, surrounding and eventually covering the pillars, until the whole complex was sealed beneath a mound of carefully deposited fill. This deliberate burial is one of the greatest mysteries of the site. It is also, from an archaeological standpoint, one of the greatest gifts, because it is precisely this careful burial that preserved the pillars and their carvings in such extraordinary condition. But why was it done? There are several theories, none of them conclusively proven, all of them worth considering.
One possibility is that the burial was a ritual act, a formal ending to the sacred life of the enclosures. In some religious traditions, sacred spaces and objects must be ritually decommissioned before they can be left behind, perhaps because they have accumulated so much sacred energy that they cannot simply be abandoned without consequence. Or perhaps because the act of burial is itself a form of offering or completion. The care with which the burial was carried out, the deliberate selection and importation of fill material, the thoroughness of the coverage, all of this suggests that it was not a hasty or casual act. It was purposeful. Whatever was happening here at the end, it was done with the same intentionality that characterized the building itself. Another possibility relates to the broader cultural and climatic changes of the period. Around 8200 BCE, the climate of this region was beginning the long drying process that would eventually produce the more arid landscape visible today. Wild animal populations were changing. The extraordinary abundance of the post-Ice Age landscape was giving way to something more constrained. And in the same period, farming communities were becoming established and spreading through the Fertile Crescent. The old way of life, the hunter-gatherer world in which Göbekli Tepe was built and used, was coming to an end. Perhaps the burial of the site reflects a conscious recognition of that ending, a closing ceremony for a world that was passing away. A monument to the past, sealed in the ground, preserved, as if those who buried it understood in some intuitive way that what they were covering over was irreplaceable.
A third possibility, not mutually exclusive with the others, is that the burial was connected to changes in religious belief or practice. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe may have been responding to a shift in their cosmological understanding, perhaps a new set of beliefs that superseded or replaced the older ones that the enclosures had served. The burial would then represent not just the ending of an era, but the deliberate retirement of the physical objects associated with the beliefs of that era, a way of honoring and sealing the old while making space for the new. We do not know. We may never know with certainty. What we can say is that the deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe was an act of great significance to the people who carried it out. They had access to a site of enormous labor and cultural investment, built by their ancestors over many generations. They chose to seal it. They chose to cover it and walk away, and in doing so, entirely without intending it, they preserved it for us, 11 or 12,000 years later, when the soil was finally cut away and the stone pillars emerged once more into the light. There is something quietly remarkable in that accidental preservation. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe could not have imagined that their act of ritual closure would function as a kind of time capsule. They could not have known that one day a German archaeologist would stand on this hill and recognize what lay beneath it. They were simply doing what their beliefs required of them, and in doing so, they reached across 12,000 years and left something in our hands. Section 12. Göbekli Tepe and the Garden of Eden. There is a connection between Göbekli Tepe and one of the oldest and most enduring stories in human culture, and it is a connection worth examining with care. Not because it proves anything theological or supernatural, but because it reflects something interesting about the deep memory of place and the way landscapes can accumulate meaning across vast stretches of time. The connection is to the biblical Garden of Eden. In the book of Genesis, the Garden of Eden is described as a place of extraordinary abundance, a garden where food grew without the labor of cultivation, where animals lived in harmony, where the first humans existed before the need for work, before the rupture that came with the acquisition of knowledge and the expulsion that followed. The location of this garden is described as being at a place where 4 rivers meet, 2 of which are named as the Tigris and the Euphrates. Now, Göbekli Tepe sits in the Fertile Crescent, the ancient arc of land in Western Asia that encompasses present-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, and southeastern Turkey. The Tigris and Euphrates both originate in the highlands of southeastern Turkey, not far from Göbekli Tepe's location. Scholars, including the author and archaeologist David Rohl, have noted that Göbekli Tepe sits near the headwaters of these 2 rivers and in a region that 10,000 years ago was significantly more lush, green, and abundant than it is today, much more consistent with the description of a garden. The landscape around Göbekli Tepe in 9500 BCE, as we noted earlier, was a world of wild wheat, wild animals in great abundance, forested hillsides, and well-watered grasslands. It was, by the standards of the time and place, an unusually rich and productive landscape. The people who lived there would have experienced it as a kind of natural abundance that provided for their needs with less labor than harsher environments required. And then, gradually, the climate changed. The land dried, the forests retreated, the great herds thinned, the wild grain became more erratic, and the people adapted, turning more and more to cultivation to supplement what the landscape no longer provided as freely. Is it possible that this real historical transition from a world of wild abundance to a world that required cultivation and labor to survive is preserved in the cultural memory of the region as the story of Eden? The shift from a garden that provided freely to a world in which one had to work the earth for one's bread? It is not a provable claim, Mythology and history are not the same thing, and the Genesis story carries thousands of years of theological interpretation that have shaped and reshaped the original narrative far beyond any simple historical record.
But there is something deeply appealing about the idea that at the root of one of humanity's oldest and most universal stories, the story of a lost golden age, a paradise surrendered, a world of abundance left behind, there may be a real memory. The memory of a time and a place when the land gave generously, when humans and wild animals shared a landscape that was rich enough for both, when the sky was full of birds and the hillsides were full of grain that no one had planted, and the memory of the moment when that world began to end. Whether or not Göbekli Tepe was the inspiration for Eden in any specific or direct sense, the two things share a resonance that is worth acknowledging. They both speak to a human sense of something original and abundant, something prior to the hard work of civilization, something that was present before the world became the complicated, labor-intensive, hierarchical place that history records. And they both invite us to consider what it might have meant to be human before any of that machinery existed, before kings, before cities, before writing, just people and stones and the enormous sky. The geophysical surveys, using techniques that can detect buried structures without disturbing the soil above them, have mapped the outlines of what appears to be at least 20 distinct enclosures spread across the mound. 4 of those have been substantially excavated. The rest are still sealed in the earth. What is on their pillars? What animals are carved into their stones? What abstract symbols mark their surfaces? Whether their layouts reveal new aspects of the cosmological system that Göbekli Tepe embodies, none of that is yet known. This is not a failure of archaeology. It is actually a conscious choice, reflecting the current best practice in the field. Excavation is irreversible. Once you dig, you cannot undig. The act of opening a site disturbs the stratigraphy, exposes materials to weathering and oxygen and light, and in the process destroys certain kinds of evidence, even as it reveals others. Modern archaeologists, wherever possible, prefer to excavate only what is necessary to answer current research questions, leaving the rest in the protective embrace of the soil for future generations of researchers, who will have access to better techniques, better analytical tools, and better questions than we currently possess. This is wise, but it also means that Göbekli Tepe is, right now, mostly a mystery, still sealed in limestone and soil. The 4 enclosures we know are extraordinary. Whatever the remaining 16 or more enclosures contain may be equally extraordinary, or more so. There may be enclosures with entirely different iconographic programs depicting animals not yet found at the site. There may be enclosures with more elaborate or complete carvings, better preserved even than what has already been found. There may be features in the unexcavated portions that change our current understanding of the site's function, chronology, or meaning in fundamental ways. Under Lee Clare and the German Archaeological Institute, work continues at a pace dictated by careful scholarship rather than popular excitement. Each season brings new discoveries. Recent work has revealed more about the later rectangular structures at the site, which represent a different phase of construction, and which have challenged the earlier view of Göbekli Tepe as purely a ceremonial site, suggesting that by a certain point in its history it was also being used for some domestic purposes, perhaps by caretakers of the sacred structures. The UNESCO inscription of 2018 has brought increased international attention to the site, along with increased funding for its protection, conservation, and study. A covered roof structure has been erected over parts of the excavated area to protect the exposed pillars from weathering. Visitor infrastructure has been developed, allowing people to see the site without damaging it. The modern world is slowly learning how to hold this ancient place with appropriate care. But the hill still keeps most of its secrets. The unexcavated majority sits quietly under the Anatolian sun, bearing within it potentially dozens of extraordinary pillars covered with images and symbols that no modern eye has seen, waiting with the patience of stone for the moment when the shovels return and the earth gives way, and one more piece of the oldest conversation in human history comes to light. Section 14. The Echoes Forward. How Göbekli Tepe changed everything.
The impact of Gobekli Tepe and on our broader understanding of human history has been and continues to be substantial. It is not simply that a very old and very impressive site has been found. It is that its existence forces a reassessment of fundamental assumptions about human nature, social complexity, and the sequence of developments that led to the world we inhabit. Before Gobekli Tepe, the prevailing model of prehistoric human development made a relatively clean distinction between the capabilities of hunter-gatherer societies and those of settled agricultural ones. Hunter-gatherers, in this model, lived in small groups, organized around the immediate practical demands of survival, without the surplus resources or the stable social structures required to support large-scale collective projects like monument building. The capacity for that kind of organized, sustained, purposeful communal effort was thought to be a product of agriculture, which created the conditions, food surplus, population growth, specialization, that allowed complex societies to develop. Gobekli Tepe demolishes that clean distinction. The people who built this site were, by all available evidence, primarily hunter-gatherers. They did not have agriculture when they started building. They did not have pottery. They did not have domesticated animals for labor or food. And yet, they organized themselves with sufficient complexity to mobilize large workforces, sustain them over extended periods, quarry and transport multi-ton stones, carve those stones with evident skill and symbolic sophistication, and maintain and develop a ritual site over what appears to be more than 1,000 years.
This tells us that the capacity for complex social organization, for purposeful collective effort on a large scale, was present in human societies much earlier and under conditions much more basic than we previously assumed. It was not created by agriculture, it predated agriculture, which means it is, in some sense, a more fundamental human trait than we thought, less dependent on material conditions and more dependent on something internal, something cognitive and social and perhaps spiritual. Göbekli Tepe also has ripple effects on our understanding of subsequent developments in the region. The Fertile Crescent, after all, is the region where many of the foundational developments of the Neolithic Revolution occurred. Not just the domestication of wheat, but the domestication of cattle, sheep and goats, the development of pottery, the establishment of the first permanently settled villages, the eventual rise of Mesopotamian civilization with its cities and writing and complex administration. Göbekli Tepe sits at the beginning of that long sequence, and its existence raises the possibility that the social and cognitive capacities that made those later developments possible were already present and already being exercised at this extraordinary site 12,000 years ago.
There are also connections to be drawn with other Neolithic sites in the region that share architectural features with Göbekli Tepe.
Nevali Chori, the site that first brought Klaus Schmidt to this region, contained similar T-shaped pillars. Karahan Tepe, located about 35 kilometers to the southeast of Göbekli Tepe, is a recently discovered site with its own elaborate carved stones and structures, currently under active excavation, that appears to be broadly contemporaneous with Göbekli Tepe, and to share significant elements of its symbolic vocabulary. Taş Tepeler, which translates as stone hills, is the name given to a broader landscape of related sites in this region, suggesting that Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a cultural and religious tradition that extended across a significant geographic area. This wider context matters because it means we are not simply talking about an eccentric local development. We are talking about a cultural world of significant breadth and sophistication, operating in the pre-pottery Neolithic of southeastern Anatolia, capable of expressing itself in monumental architecture and symbolic carving across multiple sites over a considerable landscape. Göbekli Tepe is the most impressive known site in this tradition, but it was not alone. It was part of something larger, and the shape of that larger thing is only now beginning to emerge.
For the study of the human mind, Göbekli Tepe is equally significant. The symbolic complexity of its carvings, the evidence for a coherent cosmological system expressed in stone, the apparent integration of astronomical observation with architectural planning, these all point to a level of abstract thinking, of the capacity to manipulate symbols and create shared meaning systems that was fully developed in our species 12,000 years ago. There is no cognitive gap between the people who built Göbekli Tepe and modern humans. They were us. They thought the way we think. They felt the need to make meaning, to give form to the invisible, to build something that would speak beyond the immediate moment, just as we do. For all that we know about Göbekli Tepe, for all the careful seasons of excavation, all the radiometric dating and ground-penetrating radar, all the zoological analysis of animal bones, and the painstaking photographic documentation of every carved surface, the site retains at its center a core of irreducible mystery. And that mystery is not simply the product of insufficient evidence or limited technology. Some of it is structural. Some of the most important questions about Göbekli Tepe may simply not be answerable, ever, in any definitive way. And learning to sit with that, learning to find value and meaning in a question that will never fully close, is perhaps one of the things this ancient place has to teach us. Who exactly built Göbekli Tepe? We know they were human beings. We know they lived in the pre-pottery Neolithic era of southeastern Anatolia. We know they were primarily hunter-gatherers, at least in the earliest phases of the site's use. But we do not know what they called themselves, what language they spoke, how they organized their communities, whether they had chiefs or councils or some other form of social leadership, what their daily lives looked like beyond the evidence that survives in stone and bone. They are present in their works in the way that all ancient peoples are present,
through the things they made and left behind, but the texture of their lives, the sound of their voices, the specific content of their beliefs, the names they gave to the animals on the pillars, all of that is gone.
What did they call the place? Göbekli Tepe is a Turkish name given in modern times to a hill whose original name, if it had one, has been lost for 10,000 years. The people who built this site knew it by some name, or perhaps by no formal name at all, but simply by its position in the landscape, its relationship to the water sources and hunting grounds and migration routes that organized their world. Whatever they called it, it was clearly something that generated sustained significance across many generations. The name they used and the associations it carried are among the countless things we simply cannot recover. What happened in the enclosures? We can reconstruct the broad outlines: feasting, ritual gatherings, probably some form of ceremony involving the T-shaped pillar figures, possibly skull veneration, possibly astronomical observation, possibly elaborate performance involving the imagery on the pillars as a visual backdrop or symbolic framework. But the specific content of the rituals, the words spoken or sung or chanted, the sequence of actions, the roles of different participants, the emotional and experiential quality of what took place within those circular walls among the silent stone figures, all of this is beyond recovery. We can see the stage. We cannot hear the performance. What does the full symbolic program of the site mean? We can identify the animals, we can note their frequency and their arrangements. We can observe that certain combinations recur across multiple pillars and multiple enclosures, suggesting a coherent symbolic grammar. But the meanings attached to those symbols by the people who made them, the stories they told, the cosmological narratives they encoded, remain only partially accessible. We are reading a text in a language for which we have no dictionary, and guessing at meaning from context and pattern, which gives us something but not everything. Why was construction at the site apparently organized in the way it was, with older enclosures being buried and new ones built? Was there a religious reason for the burial and replacement cycle? Was it a practical response to the physical deterioration of the stones over time? Was it a way of incorporating the older ancestral structures into the very fabric of the newer ones, so that the act of building always had the past inside it? The deliberate nature of the backfilling is clear. The motivation behind it is not. What happened to the people who built this place? They did not vanish. Their descendants continued to live in this region and to develop the Neolithic cultures of the Fertile Crescent. Some of them almost certainly were among the first farmers. Their genes are present in the populations of this region today, and through the diaspora of early farmers out of the Fertile Crescent, in populations far beyond it. But as a specific cultural community, as the people who shared the particular belief system and social organization that Göbekli Tepe embodied, they dissolved into the broader current of human history, their specific identity subsumed by the larger transformations of the Neolithic transition.
These open questions are not failures. They are the honest acknowledgement of how much distance separates us from the people who stood in these enclosures and looked up at these stone figures. 12,000 years is a very long time. It is longer than the entire recorded history of human civilization. In that interval, languages rose and fell, empires were built,
and dissolved into dust. Continents were colonized. Ice ages ended. Rivers changed their courses. Everything we think of as old is young by comparison. And yet the pillars stand, the carvings endure, the hill holds what it holds. Whatever the people who built this place believed, whatever they felt, whatever they were reaching toward in the act of carving those animals and raising those enormous stones, some residue of that intention persists in the stone itself. You can stand in enclosure D and feel it, the weight of something unresolved, something that was once fully present and known, now just beyond the edge of what can be recovered, close enough to feel, too far to name. That is the particular quality of Göbekli Tepe's mystery. It is not the mystery of something entirely alien. It is the mystery of something almost familiar, almost readable, almost within reach. These people were fully human. Their symbolic thinking, their ritual impulses, their need to give form to what they believed and felt about the world, all of it was human through and through. The gap between them and us is not one of nature. It is only one of time. And time in the long perspective is just another kind of distance. Section 16. The Hill That Sleeps. A closing.
The sun goes down over the Jurmush Mountains slowly, the way summer sunsets do in high, dry country. The sky stays bright long after the sun has dipped below the ridge, holding a deep orange light that turns gradually to lavender, then to a blue so deep it becomes almost imperceptibly different from the first darkness of night. The stars come out one at a time. The first ones, the brightest, appear before the sky has fully committed to its darkness, then more and more, until the whole dome of the heavens is illuminated with the patient fire of stars, so thick and so clear at this altitude and in this dry air, that they feel close enough to make the sky itself seem three-dimensional, a depth rather than a surface. And below those stars, Göbekli Tepe sleeps. Most of it is still in the ground. The excavated portions are covered now with their protective roof, the pillars sheltered from the weather, the carvings preserved as best as modern conservation allows. The rest of the mound rises around the excavation in its natural contours, dry grass and limestone rubble and the occasional thistle, undisturbed. The enclosures that have not yet been opened lie in their positions in the dark earth, pillars still standing in their sockets, belts and arms and animal carvings still facing inward toward whatever meaning they were placed to hold, in a darkness they have inhabited for 12,000 years. Tonight, as you lie in whatever warmth surrounds you, as the thoughts of the day settle and the sounds of your particular world fade to the background hum that underlies all sleeping, consider for a moment what it felt like to be there, not as a tourist or an archaeologist, not with any knowledge of what we have discussed tonight, but simply as a person 12,000 years ago, in the early dark before the fire went fully out, surrounded by the enormous stone figures of the enclosure, the animal carvings alive in the flickering light, the smell of the stone, cold and mineral, the sound of the wind over the top of the walls, the sense, perhaps, of being in the presence of something larger than any individual life, something collective, something that extended backward through generations and forward into futures that could not yet be named.
That is what the people who built Göbekli Tepe had, a sense of something larger, a relationship with the world that was rich enough and serious enough to motivate the most extraordinary collective effort of their age. They did not have our cities or our science or our accumulated centuries of recorded knowledge, but they had that. And in some ways, the monuments they left behind are an argument that having that is not a small thing, that it may, in fact, be the most fundamentally human thing.
The hill sits under the stars now, as it has sat under countless stars before. The pillars in the ground are still, the carvings are quiet. The animals on the stones, the foxes and the vultures and the snakes, are still and patient in their darkness. Whatever they meant to the people who put them there, whatever ceremony or story or belief they were part of, has been asleep for 12,000 years. And yet it persists, in the stone, in the evidence of organized effort and shared intention, and the extraordinary human need to make something that reaches beyond the immediate moment towards something larger and more permanent. You, lying somewhere in your particular corner of the world tonight, are the heir to that impulse. Every building you have ever found beautiful, every story that has ever moved you, every shared ritual that has given you a sense of belonging to something larger than yourself, all of it descends from the same root. The same need that drove people to that hill with their flint tools and their ropes and their enormous stones. The same need to give form to meaning, to make something that speaks beyond the moment. They built it, they decorated it, they filled it in, they walked away. And the hill has been waiting ever since, patient as only stone can be patient, for us to come and listen. We have been listening tonight, and now, gently, it is time to sleep.
Let the images settle, the hill under the stars, the stone figures in their circles, the carved animals caught mid-leap in limestone that has not moved in 12,000 years. The darkness of the unexcavated chambers, full of carvings that no living eye has seen. Let all of it drift, slowly, like fine dust over pale stone, into whatever dreams tonight decides to bring you. The ancient world is not gone. It is just sleeping in the earth, waiting to be found. To fully appreciate the symbolic world of Göbekli Tepe, it helps to spend a little more time with the people who created it, and specifically with the relationship that hunter-gatherer societies have traditionally maintained with the animal world. Because in a world without agriculture, without domesticated herds, without the managed distance between humans and animals that farming introduces, the relationship between a human community and the wild creatures of its landscape is something far more intimate, far more psychologically complex, and far more cosmologically loaded than most people in modern societies would naturally imagine.
Think about it from the inside. You are a person living in this landscape in 9,500 BCE. You have spent your entire life in close relationship with animals. You were raised in a community whose survival depended on understanding animal behavior in extraordinary detail, on knowing where the gazelles would be at what time of year, which game trails the aurochs used in which season, how to read the subtle signals in an animal's posture that told you whether it was alert or relaxed, moving or settling. This knowledge was not abstract, it was survival.
It was passed from elders to children over generations, refined and deepened with each transmission, until the accumulated animal knowledge of a community represented something genuinely profound, a body of understanding so detailed and so intimately grounded in direct experience that it exceeded what any individual observer could arrive at in a single lifetime. In this context, the animals in your world are not simply food sources or environmental features. They are presences. They have personalities, habits, and capacities that you know, in the way you know the people around you, in some cases better. The vulture that circles the ridge at a specific time each afternoon, the fox whose den is under the limestone outcrop at the edge of the hunting ground, the aurochs herd that appears every year in the valley as the grains begin to ripen. These are not interchangeable. They are individuals and species whose behaviors carry meaning, whose presence signals something about the state of the landscape, about the season, about the available food, about the spiritual condition of the world.
In many hunter-gatherer traditions documented historically and anthropologically around the world, the animals of the landscape occupy a complex position in the cosmological framework of the community. They are often considered to have souls or spirits, to be subjects of a moral universe rather than merely objects in a material one. The relationship between human hunters and animal prey is frequently understood not as a simple act of predation, but as a negotiated exchange in which the animal gives itself to the hunter in a relationship that carries obligations on both sides. The hunter owes the animal respect. The carcass must be treated properly. The bones must be handled according to specific customs. Failure to observe these protocols risks offending the spiritual presences that govern the availability of animals, and this could result in the game disappearing, the hunt failing, the community going hungry. These beliefs generate rituals, they generate images, they generate the painting of animals on cave walls, the carving of animal forms on portable objects, the making of animal masks and costumes for ceremony and dance. They generate, in short, exactly the kind of rich, sustained, symbolically complex relationship with animal imagery that we find preserved at Göbekli Tepe. The animals on the pillars are not decorations. They are not the primitive equivalent of modern wallpaper. They are the visible surface of a cosmological system in which specific animals occupy specific positions of spiritual and symbolic significance, and in which the representation of those animals in the appropriate ritual context was a meaningful and powerful act. When we look at the fox carvings at Göbekli Tepe, we are not looking at a Neolithic person who thought foxes were attractive and decided to draw one. We are looking at a representation of something that the community understood the fox to mean within their cosmological framework. The same for the vultures, the same for the snakes, the same for every animal carefully carved into those massive stones. Each one was chosen, each one was placed with intention. Each one carried a weight of meaning that was fully understood by the community that created and used the site. The meaning has been partially lost in the 12,000 years since, but the intention behind the meaning has not. It is still visible in the care and skill and repetition with which these images were made. And here is perhaps the most poignant and important thing about this. The people of Göbekli Tepe were, in their relationship with the natural world, paying attention in a way and at a depth that most modern people never achieve or even attempt. They watched the sky with sustained, patient observation, noting the movements of stars and planets and the migrations of birds. They understood the behavior of animals in the kind of detail that can only be achieved through years of direct experience and careful attention. They read the weather and the seasons from dozens of subtle signals in the landscape. Their inner lives were not impoverished by the absence of modern technology.
They were enriched in certain specific ways by the necessity of paying close, serious attention to the world around them. Göbekli Tepe is the monument that attention built. 12,000 years of careful watching, of accumulated knowledge, of shared wonder at the animals and the sky and the turning of the seasons, given permanent form in carved limestone. The animals on the pillars are not just symbols. They are a record of a very long, very serious conversation between human beings and the living world they inhabited. And they have been preserved here, in this hill, waiting for us to remember that such conversations are possible, that they may even be necessary. There is something that happens to you when you spend enough time with very old things. Not the disorientation that comes from confronting vast scales of time abstractly, not the intellectual vertigo of trying to hold 10,000 years in your mind all at once. Something quieter than that, something that settles rather than spins, a kind of recalibration. When you stand at Gobekli Tepe, or even when you simply sit with its story long enough and carefully enough, the scale of what it represents begins to do something to your sense of proportion. The things that feel urgent and large in the daily fabric of modern life begin gently to find their proper size, not because they don't matter, but because they are placed by the presence of that enormous antiquity in a context that reveals their actual scale more honestly.
12,000 years ago, a community of people whose names we will never know, whose language we will never hear, whose thoughts we can only partially reconstruct from the things they left in stone, organized themselves to build something that would last. They did not know how long it would last. They probably did not imagine it lasting as long as it has. They were building for reasons that made sense within their own cultural and religious framework, not for our benefit, not as a message to the future. And yet here it is, 12,000 years later, speaking to us with more clarity and more depth than most things built much more recently. There is a lesson in that about the relationship between intention and permanence. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not try to preserve anything for posterity. They built what they believed needed to be built, with the care and skill that their beliefs demanded, and then they buried it and walked away. The preservation was accidental. What lasted was not the plan to last. What lasted was the quality of the intention, the depth of the belief, the seriousness with which the act of building was undertaken.
This is worth holding quietly as we move through our own lives, with their accumulation of daily decisions about what to pay attention to, what to make, what to care about. Most of what we make will not last 12,000 years. Most of what we do will be forgotten within a generation or two, which is as it should be and as it has always been. But the quality of attention we bring to living, the seriousness with which we inhabit our own moment, the depth of the beliefs and commitments we bring to the things we do together with other people, those things have a persistence that is harder to measure but no less real. The people of Göbekli Tepe could not write. They could not leave us documents. They could not tell us in words what they believed or felt or hoped for. But they left us the stones, and the stones say something that does not require translation. They say, "We were here. We paid attention. We built something together that mattered to us deeply and seriously and across many generations. We gave form to what we believed, We tried to make something worthy of the world we inhabited and the forces, seen and unseen, that shaped it. That is a message that travels across 12,000 years without losing much in the transmission, because it is not a message about any particular set of beliefs or any specific cultural content. It is a message about the human act of believing, the human act of making, the human act of building something together with other people in the service of something larger than any individual life.
We are still doing that in hospitals and schools and laboratories and concert halls and village meeting rooms and city planning departments and all the thousands of places where people gather to work on something together that they believe matters. We are still doing what the people of Göbekli Tepe were doing, in forms utterly different in their specifics, but continuous in their essential human quality. The hill on the plateau in southeastern Turkey is not, in the end, a monument to a dead culture or a vanished world. It is a monument to something that did not vanish, something that is still going on, something that was present at the very beginning of the long conversation humanity has been having with itself about what matters and why and how to give it form. The stones are still there. We are still here. The conversation continues. And tonight, right now, as you feel the weight of sleep beginning to settle, as the world of daylight recedes and the deeper world of rest opens ahead of you, know that you are, in whatever small and particular way, part of that same long thread. You are the person who laid down tonight and let the ancient world come close. You listened to the story of a hill 12,000 years old, and something in you recognized it, not because you had heard it before, but because some part of what that hill represents has been in you all along.
Sleep carries you somewhere ancient every night, into the older rhythms, into the quiet that underlies everything. The people who built Göbekli Tepe would not have found that strange. The world beyond waking was for them as real and as populated as the waking one. The animals on the pillars moved in both. The stone figures watched over both. The hill held them all, waking and sleeping, the living and the dead, the known and the not yet understood. Extended section on being found, what Göbekli Tepe asks of us. Every so often the earth gives something back. Not often, not predictably, but occasionally in the course of our relentless digging into the layers of the past, we find something that stops us completely, that forces us to sit down and revise the story we have been telling ourselves about who we are and where we come from. Göbekli Tepe is that kind of find. It is one of those rare discoveries that does not simply add a new chapter to an existing narrative, but reaches back and rewrites the earlier chapters in ways that change the whole shape of the story.
Before Göbekli Tepe, the story of human civilization had a fairly clean beginning. Agriculture came first, settled communities followed. Religion and monumental architecture came after that. It was a story about accumulation, about complexity building on complexity, each development resting on the foundation of the one before it. It was a reassuring story in a way. It suggested that civilization was an achievement,
something built step by patient step from simpler to more complex, and that the simplest and earliest humans were also the most limited, the least capable, the furthest from the kind of inner richness that we associate with fully developed human consciousness and culture. Göbekli Tepe does not allow that comfortable story. It reaches back to the very beginning of the period we call civilization, to the era before farming, before pottery, before cities, and it shows us people building something magnificent, something organized and deliberate and symbolically sophisticated, something that required not just practical skill and physical labor, but a rich and coherent interior life, a cosmological framework, a set of shared beliefs deep enough and compelling enough to motivate a community or a network of communities to enormous sustained collective effort. What that tells us about the earliest humans is not that they were primitive in any meaningful sense. What it tells us is that they were fully human all the way down from the very beginning. The capacity for abstract thought, for symbolic expression, for the organization of collective effort around shared beliefs was not a late development in our species. It was always there. It has been there, as far as the archaeological record can tell us, for as long as there have been people.
This is a humbling and a strangely comforting thing to understand. Humbling because it removes the comfortable distance we sometimes maintain between ourselves and the people of the deep past, the assumption that their minds were somehow smaller or simpler than ours, that the gap between us and them is a gap of cognitive capacity and not merely a gap of accumulated knowledge. Comforting because it suggests that the things we most value in ourselves, curiosity and wonder and the impulse to make meaning and to build community and to give form to what we believe about the world, are not achievements we might lose if things became hard enough. They are part of what we are. The people who built Göbekli Tepe did not have it easy. Their world was not comfortable in any modern sense. They faced predators and disease and the uncertainties of a life that depended on the unpredictable generosity of wild landscapes. They experienced loss and grief and the fear of the unknown. And out of all of that, out of a life that was, by any material measure, far more precarious and demanding than ours, they still found the time and the energy and the collective will to build something extraordinary, something that reached toward whatever they understood as the sacred, something that gathered their community together in a shared act of meaning-making on a scale that still commands our respect 12,000 years later. That is a remarkable thing to know about human beings. It is the kind of thing worth carrying with you, not just tonight as you drift toward sleep, but on all the ordinary days when the making of meaning can feel like a luxury, when the practical demands of survival seem to crowd out everything else, when the question of what any of it is for can feel too large and too exhausting to approach. The people of Göbekli Tepe approached it anyway, with flint tools and ropes and the strength of many hands working together. They carved their answer to that question into limestone that has lasted 12,000 years. We may not be able to read the specific content of their answer, but we can see the size and the seriousness and the beauty of the effort. We can see that they believed it mattered, that making meaning mattered, that building something together in the service of what they understood as real and sacred and important was not a distraction from the work of living, but the very heart of it. And then the hill closed over them, and the stars continued to turn, and the seasons came and went over that rounded mound in the Gurmish Mountains, the grasses growing and dying, the limestone crumbling at the surface, while the buried stone stayed cool and still and perfect in the earth. And 10,000 years passed,
and then another 1,000, and then another. Until one October in 1994, a German archaeologist climbed to the top of a hill that local people called Potbelly Hill and looked down at the limestone fragments scattered across the surface and understood what he was standing over, and the story that had been sleeping in the earth began very slowly to wake up. That is the nature of what the past does. It sleeps, and sometimes when the conditions are right, when the person with the right knowledge arrives in the right place, it opens its eyes. Not all at once, not fully, but enough to show us something real, enough to change the shape of what we thought we knew, enough to remind us that the human story is longer and richer and stranger and more various than we had previously imagined, and that the earliest chapters of it are not about limitation and simplicity, but about wonder and effort and the deep, persistent human need to make something that reaches beyond the immediate moment towards something more lasting. Göbekli Tepe is still being excavated. Season by season, more of it comes to light. New pillars emerge from the soil. New carvings become visible. New questions form, because every answer at this site seems to generate more questions than it resolves. The full story of the hill will not be known in our lifetimes, or perhaps in our children's lifetimes. The earth still holds most of it. But what has been given back to us already is extraordinary. A window into a world 12,000 years old, showing us people who were fully and recognizably human, standing in circles of enormous stone among carvings of the animals that shared their world, participating in rituals whose specific content we cannot recover, but whose depth and seriousness are written into every chisel mark and every carefully placed stone. They were here. They built this. They believed it mattered. And we have found them. Sleep now. Let the hill be still in your mind. Let the carved animals settle into their stone, and the old, old darkness return around them. Let the stars wheel overhead as they have always wheeled, indifferent and beautiful. Let the distance close between you and them. That distance of 12,000 years, until it is nothing but the ordinary distance between one human life and another. The distance of different circumstances and different times, but the same deep ground. The same reaching toward the light, the same building of something together, the same wondering at the world. And if the slow drift of very old history has carried you somewhere quiet tonight, somewhere restful, somewhere a little further from the noise of the present, then the channel has done what it set out to do. We are Heo, boring history for sleep, and we are grateful, more than you might know, that you are here. If tonight's journey to the ancient hills of Anatolia has given you even a few minutes of peace, please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing to the channel. We are climbing toward 1,000 subscribers, 1,000 people who have decided that the quiet corners of the past are worth spending the dark hours in. Every subscription brings us closer to that mark, and every one of them matters. Leave a comment if you have a little warmth to spare.
tell me where in the world you are right now. Tell me what time it says on your clock. It is a strange and beautiful thing to imagine all the different places this voice travels to in the night, all the different rooms and beds and hammocks and headphone-wearing commuters and insomniacs, all of you, somewhere, listening to the story of a hill in Turkey that is older than farming, older than writing, older than almost everything we call civilization. You are part of that story now, in the small way that anyone who listens becomes part of what they hear. And that, quietly, is enough. Sleep well. The hill will still be there when you wake.